Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Metzler, Director of Programming here at SF DocFest. Welcome back. We've been kind of screening really interesting independent documentaries from around the world for 2 decades, and it's always interesting what kind of comes through our submissions. And this year, you just had a chance to see one of my favorite films, No Time to Fail. It happens to be done by one of our previous Vanguard Award winners, Sarah Archambault. Welcome, Sarah. And we also have her co-director, Margot Guernsey. Welcome, Margot.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It just was a delight to watch this film in the sense that I think we all know that it's these, this is a serious issue, but I just loved how light on its feet and I just love the people that you spent time with in the sense of they are just such cool, quirky, interesting people. And so it just made me love the subject from a totally different vantage point. And maybe a good place to start is how did you decide that this was kind of the rabbit hole you wanted to go down and that knew that there was a film here, but also how did you get access to kind of tell these kind of personal stories that we see in the film?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, just so great to be back this year. I love this festival so much. I love what you, Jeff, and the team do. So thanks so much for including us again this year. How did we come to this subject matter? Well, Margot and I are both complete civic nerds. We love kind of politics, but not just politics. You know how some people like politics is their sports. Indeed, that's probably true for Margot and I. But more than that, we're really interested about like our civic life, how we lead it, how we lead it, how people make decisions. And a thing that we knew maybe a little bit less about were the people who actually manage our civic process, that actually shepherd in the decision making the public does, and help navigate that entire experience for people. When the pandemic first started, if anyone can remember all the way back then, March 2020. Well, it happened before then, but you know what I'm saying. It kind of like hit our streets with a bigger bang in March 2020. Among the things that we were thinking about the upcoming presidential preference primary in Rhode Island. It was supposed to be happening, I believe, in April or May. And one of the big things that needed to happen was the postponement of that date. One of my very good friends was working for the Secretary of State at the time. And I was asking her, I was like, well, how are you guys going to do this? At this point, election denial, denying election results, questioning the process, all of that kind of stuff was not really on the table. It was really just, how will this happen in a pandemic? We really haven't seen this kind of need to shift the way we do things in our elections for a very, very long time, if ever. And I believe even during like the Spanish flu, am I wrong, that like elections still took place during that time? So this was the first really kind of big challenge, and Nicole's like, we need to postpone our date. We need to figure this all out. We need to completely rethink the ways in which people are going to be voting this year. And I said, well, would the Secretary of State be interested in documentary filmmakers following that process? Now, of course, at this moment, it's like, that's a crazy idea. Watching local government bureaucracy problem solve in full view, that's something that most people would be nervous about. But in fact, Secretary of State Gorbea was welcomed this transparency and was actually quite interested in it. So I don't know, Margot, why don't you talk a little bit about your experience filmmaking in Rhode Island and how you connected back to this part of the story?
Yeah, so Sarah said to me, called me up and said, she has this crazy idea. And to be perfectly honest, the first thing I thought in my head is, how is this going to translate on screen? I mean, how could it possibly be interesting? And yet, to me, civics has always been almost sexy, right? Participation, people making joint decisions. And my prior work, and actually before I became a filmmaker, I was a union organizer, and I've just really turned my camera
Right.
and my life toward the unseen labor that drives our economy. So the work that most of us do that is completely unseen and unvalued. And that is exactly what the story is, right? I mean, for those of us, all of us vote, most of us vote, and we're completely unaware of what it takes to pull off an election. So, you know, it was right up my alley, even though there were some challenges. And so that was the journey as how it started.
And do you, you know, as you started kind of digging in, I mean, you know, I know sometimes there's these kinds of sensitivities in regards to, you know, folks sharing their story. How did you get people on board, you know, one by one? And also, how did you deal with the challenges of like filming during a pandemic?
Yeah, those are two really good questions. I'll take the first one about getting people on board. You know, in my experience, it really often takes a lot of trust building and a lot of time. And quite frankly, wouldn't want to ask someone to have a camera follow them around if they don't know me and don't know the team and don't really understand what our intentions are. I think that we were in a position where their feet were already to the fire when we came in. And some of the people we talked to who are not in this film didn't want to dive in this way, and that was fine with us. But some did, and so we didn't have ramp up time to really build those relationships. We both have deep roots in Rhode Island, and that definitely helped open doors because we were trusted by people that folks in the film knew, even if they didn't know us personally. And the folks who were in the film just decided that they wanted people to see their work as much as we wanted to show the world the work that they do. Sarah, do you want to talk about COVID?
Oh my gosh. Well, you know, I think one of the things that you know, Margot was just talking about was, you know, normally you would build that level of trust. And therefore, when you are in the field with people, particularly under conditions that might feel risky, hazardous, etc., well, that trust is already built and you already have that shorthand. In this case, we had to build it in different ways. And so, for example, I mean, there were some film productions, Chris, as you know, that that really kind of like boldly went ahead into COVID territory with full crews and all that kind of matter. I think for Margot and I, it was not the right ethical choice for several reasons. One was we just weren't comfortable sending crews in at that time. These offices are quite small. The conditions at the time that we were shooting in Rhode Island were the worst per capita COVID rates in the country.
Oh, wow.
And so it just, you know, where I think maybe risk mitigation was different for other films out there, for us, it felt quite serious. And I think importantly, there's no B team on elections. These offices, as I mentioned, are quite small. The staffs are limited. They're the only people. Now, when you're there for election day, you see all these different kinds of folks at the polls themselves. The actual election officials who do the year-round work on maintaining the databases and the voter rolls, processing applications, planning all of the you know, election day event logistics. These folks are incredibly small staffs. They are incredibly local. They are your neighbors, and there isn't a backup team. There's not a bench. So if they got sick, like you can't postpone or be like, I'll do it later because I need to take a week out to be sick. That doesn't exist for these folks. So the risk, not just to film crew, but the risk to our subjects and particularly to our local governments felt very real to us. So Margot and I have some ridiculous photos. I wish I had them on me. Like we had like the shields and masks and goggles and in my case, I like wore a jumpsuit so when I got home, I could strip down before I went into the house with my kids. We had no idea at that point, right? At that particular moment, this was pre-vaccine. Um, we had no idea if it was still at that time transferred just in the air or also by touch. So there are a variety of things that we tried to take into consideration. We work with cinematographers to help plot out our course and the ways in which we should be covering these spaces. We worked with a sound a recordist to come in, help us mic the space, pre-mic it, and sometimes just help work with us with our subjects around like how best to mic the environment to cover the space. So we were working with professional crews, but Margot and I, who are not professional shooters, were the people, not professional sound recordists. She's more of a director, I'm more of a producer. We're in those spaces and doing all the shooting. And again, because we had the relationships, that trust was built, and Margot and I were also testing frequently to make sure that we could report in, and we were transparent with our subjects about what our testing regimen was as well. So it was very layered and really intense. So a very different kind of shooting experience than I was ever used to.
Yeah, very much so. That'll be an interesting one to look back on, years from now. I imagine the kind of same civic-minded sort of folks that are profiled in the film you could find in many kind of election offices around the country. But like, what do you think was kind of particularly unique about the kind of Rhode Island experience and the kind of characters that we meet?
I think there's so many kind of wonderful things. And Chris, just to spin on this a little bit, Margot and I had thought at one point, maybe we should be doing a few different locations, and should we be exploring about going to different places around the country? It's something that we considered briefly. However, one of the things that this trust issue was, again, so important that in trying to build those relationships quickly in Rhode Island, a place where we were known, had recommendations, and had long time community experience, was one thing. Trying to do that in other states during a very difficult time was near impossible. So we had considered it, but we realized it felt a little bit of an unethical practice at the time. And what was special is that we knew in Rhode Island we could go very deep, and you could really get to know these characters as human beings. You would get to know how Rob burns burgers, and you would get to know about Kathy's sailor type engagement in her office. You get these salty characters, right? Very down to earth characters, and you would know them well. And then as you came to know them, you would come to love and trust them and trust their work. So the deep dive in Rhode Island was very much about, again, like going deep in one place. It's also, I'm from there. So part of it is like kind of what was nice is that you get a little bit of like local flavor as well.
Yeah.
Part of the Rhode Islandness to me is the smallness, how they all like overlap and how they all like bump into each other at different offices, and you see one on the phone with the other, or you're going to see Nick there. Like, it's all very kind of small and collegial, where in states like Texas, Michigan, those kinds of things, those teams probably interact, but it's not like, you're just kind of you're one cousin away from all of these folks in Rhode Island.
I'm not sure the mail ballot delivery piece happens everywhere. I suspect it happens in other states, but there's something to love about the smallest state in our nation, where you can get your mail ballot hand delivered to your house so that you still have time to vote.
By the director of elections in the state.
Yeah, they it's interesting because I think you just like, it just wound up being really special the time that you spent with all of them. So a curiosity, obviously some time has passed, since the election, and we've seen, the insurrection of the Capitol and all this election denialism. And of course, this last week, the kind of settlement with Dominion and Fox News. What's the postscript? What's the folks there in the film? What are they up to nowadays? And like, what do they think about all this craziness that's happened in the last 2 years?
It's been a hard 2 years for election officials, and in a lot of ways, we documented unknowingly the creep of that. Right, as we were filming, that was starting to creep in, and since then, no one wants to end a film on a sour note, but the reality was that we ended it as the attacks on elections officials were ramping up, as the the laws being proposed to severely restrict voting were being proposed in states across the country, and we've gotten through the midterms. elections. But what we're hearing on the ground is that people are expecting things to continue to get worse, right? So the attacks are coming back. Women election officials are reporting that when they tell law enforcement that they're, they're being threatened, they're not believed. And people are really sort of hunkering down and getting ready for another round in 2024. The folks in our film, all of them except Sonia Grace from Central Falls, are still working in elections, are really passionate about their jobs and have continued on. And I think are role models for other folks, and they're connected across the country. Another thing that's happened is that support groups for election officials have started to form because of the situation. And so they're, both through the film and just on their own, folks are connecting with each other and, continuing to do the work.
I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say, like, in many ways, Margot, the nature of election work has shifted, as Margot was saying, to compensate for that threat environment. So, for example, certain kinds of conferences on election administration used to talk more about like bureaucratic practices, cybersecurity, things of that matter. Now they have sessions on how to verify and report threats to the FBI. Now they have sessions around these various kinds of local protections that they need to put in place for their own bodily safety. These were energies that they used to direct toward protecting the vote. They now have to protect themselves. We are like doubling that effort in many ways. We are seeing not just, I think that the final credits of the film mention an exodus of professionals from the field. It is also being really difficult to recruit folks to come and do this work at this point. It is really, they are such essential frontline workers for our democracy. And we are at a crisis point in our democracy if we cannot support these local folks in helping us in our decision-making process in the ways that we have historically in this country.
Yeah, hear, hear. I know a lot of folks are probably wondering, what can they do, and also how can they kind of help support the film and follow it? How can folks learn more and kind of spread the word about the film?
Yep. So to learn more about the film and follow along, go to notimetofailfilm.com. And we're going to have, we have screenings around the country still going on, and we're going to hopefully have some more information about streaming and broadcast soon. And then I would say that on a lighter note, there are a lot of groups that have come together to work towards security for election officials and funding for infrastructure for elections. And so if you're interested in supporting the election officials who are on the front lines, I would look locally into getting involved in, funding decisions, staffing decisions, making sure that your local election officials have what they need to do their jobs.
It's a simple place to start, but volunteer to be a poll worker. I mean, that's like one way in which you can really help alleviate stress on the process. I know this seems like maybe not a really important thing to do, but say thank you. Like, they're getting so many threats, they're getting so many other kinds of forms of public engagement. Showing them some love, and appreciation for the work that they're doing actually does go a long way. It is meaningful to them. So even that kind of thing is really helpful. And then encourage your local Congress people to get behind supporting election workers in every way they can.
Very cool. Well, thanks again for making a terrific film, and all the best with it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Most definitely.